Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and we are kicking off April with the Armiger Knights, or the Armiger Warglaive painting guide. This is going to be a couple of parts, I think, starting with all the sort of metalwork and under chassis and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll finish off with all the armour panels and all the rest of the detailing. So this first video is the metalwork, so let's crack straight into the video. Now before we actually break into the painting guide, I wanted to sort of cover a bit of background. So my Knights and my Titans are all part of the Legio Astorum, part of the Collegia Titanica, founded on the forge world of Lucius in the Segmentum Obscurus. One of the oldest legions, or one of the oldest Titan legions around. And I've used this paint scheme across all of my Knights, including the Titans and including some of the household Knights, some of which has been a little bit dubious. You know, a few comments have been banded around saying, well, these Knights are all, you know, sort of household Knights and they don't belong to a Legio. But actually some of the background instigated with the Legion of, well, with the Knights, instigated that some of these households were adopted and became part of the Legio themselves, adopted all of the colour schemes and so on. And you can see here my Reaver Titan and all the other Knights that have formed part of this Legio. So the Warp Runners, the Legio Astorum, and yeah, pretty proud of this colour scheme, to be honest. It's quite a striking scheme, and it did enable me to actually win a painting award. So I was the Engine of Legend with that Reaver Titan at a Warhammer event not that long ago. Now the full painting guide is available in the Imperial Armour Model Masterclass Volume 2, where they paint a Reaver Titan, and I've extrapolated that painting guide into my Knights. So if you want to go and have a look at that book, I highly recommend these Forge World Imperial Armour Model Masterclasses. They are on my shelf permanently, and I do refer to a lot of those, a lot of the items in those books. They are really, really good. So starting on these little baby Knights then, so the Armiger Warglaives. And as I said, I think in a previous video, I am batch painting these. So as you can see, I've got 4 of these legs, all primed with gunmetal through my airbrush. I was going to use lead belcher, but discovered that my lead belcher spray was actually empty. So what I want to do is take the legs from one of my other Knights, one of my Knight Errants, and replicate that as best possible on these smaller ones. So I wanted to have a good look at how I did this before. A little bit difficult to try and remember the paint schemes that I did, because I painted these way before I was doing YouTube and trying to record everything that I was doing. But just wanted to sort of compare the Armiger legs compared to the Errant legs, and you can see an awful lot of similarity here, so I wanted to make sure that I try and replicate that as best possible. So the first thing I'm going to do over the lead belcher, over the gunmetal prime, is just dollop a load of Nuln oil all over it, and this will really darken down the metal. The actual spray, the gunmetal Vallejo colour that I've used here is actually pretty dark anyway, and this will really darken it down and enable me to highlight it with extensive amounts of dry brushing. These models and this kind of framework or chassis on these metal models is pretty good for dry brushing. It's a technique that I would highly recommend for this. I know it's not an advanced technique by any stretch of the imagination, but you try and hand paint this in any other way and you could be here a while. Now I know people that have done that and the effect is pretty stunning. But for my level of painting and the effects that I'm going for, a dry brush is perfectly fine. Now once that Nuln oil is dried, you can see how darkened down this has become. And what we're going to do now is take a chainmail silver, which is pretty equivalent to the lead belcher dry paint, and just liberally dry brush this colour all over it, just to brighten it up, bring back some of the metal sheen, but still leaving that Nuln oil recessed wash exactly where it needs to stay, in all the crevices, nooks and crannies all over the model. Now I really want to sort of focus on some of those big flat areas and make sure that begins to pop with the dry brush, and just sort of really focus on that area so that it does begin to sort of polish up, as it were, and then just apply the rest of the dry brush all over all the joints, the rivets and all that kind of stuff across the rest of the model. Fairly easy to do. Everyone knows how to dry brush, I'm fairly sure. It's one of the first painting techniques that pretty much everybody learns, and just making sure that goes all over the model. And once that's complete, you can see it sort of begins to catch all those edges, and it begins to brighten the model up quite substantially. And yeah, it looks all right to me, I think, so far. So just sort of making sure that I haven't missed anything, and you can see the sort of the highly polished top ends of those hip joins and so on, just the sort of the right effect. Now just to make a little bit of extra definition, a very, very light brush of a really brighter silver, so the next shade up, or the next highlight up as it were, from chainmail silver is pure silver. And I'm just going to sort of pick out just some of the very, very higher points of the model here, so just sort of around the engine casings or the hip casings, some of those rivets and joins and so on. Just a very, very light dry brush. This isn't, you know, you're not trying to do too much with this and trying to, you know, sort of go top down as it were, where it would naturally catch the light. I'll just put the remainder of this dry brush into a little bit of fast forward here, so it's going at twice the normal speed. And you can see it's just really, really light, just flicking the brush over, just trying to pick out those little extra high points just with that one extra little bit of silver blast here, just to pick out that extra bit of detail. You don't have to do this stage if you don't want to. I think the standard dry brush is pretty good, but just because I want these to look a little bit extra special, that's what I've done. Now it's time to pick out some of the detail, and I'm going straight in with brass because this is the scheme that my other Knights Errant and Paladins and so on have all taken. So I'm just going to start picking out the same panels that I did on those other Knights with the brassy brass colour from Vallejo. So I think this is like Dwarven brass from Games Workshop. It's sort of the darker brass colour that's available. So trying to be really careful with the way that you apply this, making sure that you don't go onto any of the bits that you definitely don't want to come back and try and touch back up with the silver that you've already done. So really trying to focus with a more of a fine brush. I think this is a 0 brush that I'm using here, and just trying to pick out all those same areas that I've done using the Knight Errant legs that I showed earlier as a reference guide. So that's just off camera. So you can see I picked out that bit of top housing. Now I'm picking out all the cables because, as I said, this is a reference from the Errant Knight that I'm doing. So just pick out all those armoured cables and any other bits that you really want to do. But obviously I'm trying to match my other paint scheme, so I'm being quite specific where I'm targeting this brass. But you could pick out other bits on the knee joins or on the hip joins and so on. But that's, as you can see now, I've done all the hoses and those sort of side vents and that front bit of detail as well. And that's where I've applied the brass, nice and easy. So what I'm now going to do is darken down those pistons, and I'm going to go over those with black to start with. So I'm just going to black out all the piston areas so that I can actually apply a piston sort of wear and tear. So if you imagine pistons were black originally, and where they've gone in and out of their housing as the knight has walked a little bit, those will begin to sort of shine and polish up. So what I'm going to do is paint those in black first, and then come back to paint over those with some more chainmail silver and show a little bit of wear and tear. So just filling out the rear pistons on those legs, and then the front larger pistons as well. So there's those ones to do, and then there's the ones up by the hip joint as well. So that's exactly what's going on here. And once all those areas are blacked in, this is the result you end up with. I'm using that airbrush black, which does take a couple of coats to get through to make sure that it's a nice solid black colour. And you can see I've done those hip joins and those front and rear pistons. Now what I'm going to do next is the feet. Now this is straight out of the Imperial Armour Model Masterclass, and the idea here is to make sure those feet and toes look like they are made of some kind of super reinforced metal that's been a bit worn and torn. These are the sections of the model that are really going to get battered as they walk through the battlefield of the 41st millennium. And this is an interesting technique, really. So we're starting off with a very old colour of Caradon granite mixed with a little bit of black. And I'm going to apply that to all of the toe sections. So there's 3 toes on each, making sure that I don't go into where all the sort of the mini toe pistons are, just leaving those in metallic, and just fill out all the rest of the block colour in this. It's probably 75% granite and then 25% black, just to darken it down a little bit. But this forms the base colour of the metal that we're going to be doing on the toes. And as I said, this is straight out of the Imperial Armour Model Masterclass. They show a single picture in that book with a load of descriptive words. So trying to extrapolate and make sure that you try and replicate the effect is always a little bit of a challenge, because Forge World don't do their little guide videos like Duncan from Warhammer TV. So once we move there, then you can see all of the 6 toes are now applied with this darkened granite colour. And again, just as a reminder, this is to make sure that these look a bit more worn and torn, but look like they're made of a super tough adamantium effect kind of metal. Now to complete the rest of the effect, we're going to use tin, gold, chainmail silver, silver and seraphim sepia right at the very end to tie all the colours together. We're going to grab a sponge and we're going to stipple first over a load of tinny tin, or whichever Games Workshop equivalent you have. So it's the darker of the tin colours, and we're just going to sponge that on all over the toes and around those areas there, just as you can see. I'm using a little bit of old packing foam. I think that came in one of the old sprues, or it might even come in with a pick and pluck foam case. And that's the effect there. Once you've completed that, you've got sort of stippled on a tin effect, just dotted all over the toes, really, nothing overly complicated. We now move on and repeat that process, but we've added a little bit of gold into the tin colour, so it's a little bit more bright, and we just stipple on slightly less than we were before. So just sort of a couple of sponges applied to each toe, and this this sort of mixes up the metal effect on each toe itself, so it looks like it's made of a real high grade composite material. And then finally we go over that again with another sponge effect. Oh, actually, sorry, no, we dry brush the silver over the top, not a sponge on this case. And this just picks out all those edges and corners, a very light dry brush over the top. And this is done with both the chainmail silver and then the pure silver over the top. Just a real light dry brush, and you can see that just picks out all of those little corners and angles on the toes. And then the final bit to that is to add the seraphim sepia. So just apply that over the top and let that dry off, and that sort of blends and binds all of those metallic colours together. And then once we've done that, you can see that it's still a little bit wet. It does sort of dry a little bit brighter than that, but you can see the effect right at the very end of the video when I show the final effect of where we get to. So that's now dried off, and you can see actually now that metalwork has sort of all tied itself in together, but you can still see all the corners and stuff are all nicely bright from that final edge highlight of the silver. Now what we're going to do is go back to the pistons. Now I did mention all we're going to do is make sure that these pistons look a little bit worn and torn. So where they're all nice and new and black, right at the very tops of these we're going to apply a very fine almost dry brush, and then sort of pull the colour down towards the bottom of the piston. So you start at the top where the piston housing is, so that's where the actual piston would go into the other part of the socket, and then form that kind of worn effect. So leaving right at the very bottom still black, right at the very top a bit more shiny, and then just sort of drag the brush towards the bottom of the piston. And we go and complete that, and this is the effect that you end up with. You can see right at the very top it all looks a bit shiny, where it's all been worn through, and all the bottom is still remaining dark. And what we're going to do after this is then apply an oil type sheen. But we'll leave those colours to fully dry first, and we've still got a couple of bits of detail that we can do before the oil sheen effect. Let's go back to our glorious gold, or a bright gold, and then just fill in some of these moving parts on the piston, so some of the joins and so on. You could have done this in brass if you wanted to, but just to add a little bit of contrast in the metalwork, I wanted to put these in gold. And then once they're washed with Agrax Earthshade, they just look like another darker metal. It just adds a little bit of interest and contrast to the legs, so that not everything is all sort of brass. But you could have just done these in brass when you did all the others. It's just a personal preference here. And you can see I've also painted those sort of 3 weird stripy bits on the front of the black of the legs there, just to add a little bit of detail. But that's the rear hinge sections, as it were, that goes up and down on those pistons, and then the bottom ankle joint as well, so just where it sort of pivots and holds its own weight. And what we can do now is make this oil sheen wash. Now this is using a bit of black, a bit of seraphim sepia, and then gloss varnish. So it's mostly seraphim sepia, a couple of dollops of varnish, and then a single drop of black just to darken down the sepia wash. I'm just going to apply that all over the pistons, all over the piston housing, and just acts as like an oil sheen. So with that gloss varnish, it will sort of shine up a little bit, as if these have been, given a good dose of WD-40. So I'm just going to finish off going around all those pistons. I'm using a fairly oldish brush just to slather this stuff on. And you want to make sure it's given a good covering. Now don't also forget the pistons around the hip as well. So these are going to get given the same effect. So a little bit of gold paint on those and then cover them in this oil sheen type effect wash. So it's fairly simple to do, but the big effect is when it dries out. So that's what you're looking for. So once it's dried, you can just about make out here that it does sort of begin to shine, especially on the black. You can see that catching the light in the room, to be honest. And that metal or the dry brush at the very top now looks like it's been deliberately lubricated accordingly, according to the Adeptus Mechanicus rites of battle. They've been fully prepared for battle. So finally then, we're just going to do a bit of Agrax Earthshade over that gold, just to tone that down a little bit, because you don't want it to be all sort of nice and shiny and blingy. So we're just going to use a bit of old-fashioned Agrax Earthshade, and we're also going to do that over the gold and then over these brass parts as well. So wherever we've got brass, we'll apply Agrax Earthshade, which is everyone's favourite wash in the entire world. Everyone should use it. Especially my friend over at Sonic Sledgehammer Studios. He loves a bit of Agrax Earthshade, as do I. And as you can see there, I've just applied it to the gold, and that sort of darkens that down, and then that is all the sort of the metalwork-ish complete around the feet. So that completes the leg section. Now we just need to move on to the upper torso. If you can remember from the build video, I've kept all of the armour panels separate, and this has been sprayed again with gunmetal, and all we're going to do is apply exactly the same techniques to this as we have done with the legs. Now I'm not going to cover everything in depth on this one, because it is the same technique as the legs. All you've got to do is pick out the bits of brass and everything else that you want. But this is just kind of a reminder that whilst the leg activities are going on, you can be doing the same with the torso, and also with the weapon arms as well, and also with his head. So just as a reminder, you can do all the dry brushing, all the brass effect and everything else all over this guy. And once we are done, we are at this stage. So the legs are pretty much complete, and the upper torso is complete to the point of the same level as the legs. Still a bit more detail to go on there. And then the weapon arms as well. So all the brass work washed with Agrax and everything else dry brushed exactly the same as the legs. So there we go then, guys. That is part 1 of the Armiger Warglaive painting guide. So we've completed all the metalwork, all the legs are done, all the torso is mostly done. There's still a little bit more detail to go on there. And the weapons have been brought up to the same stage as the torso. So we've got all the brass banding, and all the silver work has all been dry brushed and everything else. So that's all good to go. So the next stage then will be all the armour panels and all the little bits of fine detailing, and then obviously the basing right at the very end. But I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you enjoyed the guide, hope you learned something useful from it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video where we'll be moving in to the rest of the detail work on this guy. Thank you very much for watching, catch you next time.